My name is Rachel Morgan, and for as long as I can remember, I've been the one no one expected to amount to anything. They called me sensitive, soft, too weak to handle the real world. In our house, the word fragile wasn't a comfort. It was an insult, a label whispered with a smirk at the dinner table. My sister Abigail was the golden one, the one with medals and certificates pinned to every wall, the perfect daughter who could do no wrong. People would stop my parents in the grocery store to talk about her accomplishments, and I'd stand right there holding the cart, invisible. Even as a teenager, I could feel the weight of that comparison like a stone strapped to my chest. Every stumble I made became proof that they were right, and every time I tried to push forward, I was reminded, in a dozen quiet ways, that I wasn't her and never would be. When I dropped out of college after one bad semester, they didn't ask me why. They didn't see the panic attacks or the nights I couldn't breathe, the mornings when I stared at myself in the mirror and felt like I was unraveling. To them, it was simple. Rachel failed, and Abigail kept shining. At family dinners, they toasted her promotions, her flawless discipline, her shining reputation, while I sat in the corner with a polite smile, careful not to let my hands shake too much when I picked up my glass. I learned to sit quietly and listen to the way my father's voice softened when he said her name, how my mother's face would light up just talking about her. And when they talked about me at all, it was in that half-pitying tone. Like I was a stray they had decided not to take in. You can get used to that kind of dismissal. You can even start to believe it. But here's what they never knew. I wasn't fragile. I was just silent. I was learning to take all that weight and turn it into something sharp enough to cut through the expectations they wrapped around me like chains. For years, I carried their doubt like a shadow, and I never said a word while I built myself into something they couldn't imagine. I disappeared, and they thought that was the end of my story. But sometimes walking away isn't failure. Sometimes it's the only way to survive long enough to come back stronger. And when I did, they didn't see me coming. I drove into Tulsa just as the sun was sinking low, turning the streets of my childhood into long shadows. The neighborhood looked exactly the same as the day I left. The same leaning mailbox at the end of my parents' driveway. The same porch light flickering like it could never quite decide to stay on. I sat in the car for a while, hands resting on the steering wheel, listening to the quiet hum of cicadas that always made summer nights feel heavy. It had been years since I set foot here. Years since I heard my last name spoken like it belonged to someone worth talking about. The invitation had come as a text from my mother, short and clipped. No warmth in the words. Come for Abby's celebration. Don't make a scene. It wasn't really an invitation. It was a reminder that I was expected to show up, sit down, and stay silent. Inside, the house smelled like cinnamon and ham, exactly the same as it had when I was 17. The dining room was dressed up like a military banquet. Banners taped to the walls. A big poster with "Congratulations, Captain Abigail Morgan," written in red paint. A table set with polished silverware and folded napkins that probably hadn't been used in years. I stepped in wearing a plain gray shirt, jeans, nothing that drew attention, hoping to pass like a ghost through the chatter. They noticed me only enough to glance and turn back to their conversations. My father asked, without even looking up, what I was doing these days. And before I could finish a single sentence, he cut me off to tell another story about Abigail's perfect scores in strategy and leadership. My aunt sipped her wine and smirked, asking if I was still trying to figure out who I want to be when I grow up. And the table laughed softly, just enough to sting. I sat there and let it all pass over me, feeling that old weight pressed down. Every toast was for her. Every bright smile and proud glance landed on her uniform. When they ran out of water glasses, it was me they asked to refill them, like I was still a teenager carrying trays in the background. There wasn't a seat saved for me, so I pulled a folding chair from the porch and sat near the edge of the room. From there, I watched it all. The perfect picture of a perfect family, with a space at the table for everyone but me. The room was warm with the sound of glasses clinking and easy laughter, The kind of laughter that only comes when people are completely sure of their place. Abigail sat at the center of it all, in her crisp dress uniform, a polished metal gleaming under the lights, answering questions about her training with a confidence that made the whole table lean in closer. My parents hung on every word, nodding proudly as if they'd personally forged her into something untouchable. Cousins I hadn't seen in years circled around her like satellites, asking about the base, about her next assignment, about how she'd managed to earn promotions so quickly. And me? I was a piece of furniture in that room, silent and unnoticed, until someone needed something done. It started with a pitcher of water, then more napkins, then an extra fork for someone who'd dropped theirs. Every request was made without a glance, as if the habit of treating me like an errand runner had never really faded. I carried the glasses to the kitchen, filled them with tap water, and walked back in to hand them out. No one paused the conversation or offered to help. I set the glasses down and moved around the edges of the table, invisible but useful, like I had been all through my teenage years. Even when I finally sat down again, my chair creaked from the cold metal frame I'd dragged in from the porch. They were back to telling stories about Abigail's leadership, about her perfect form during field drills, about how she never cracks under pressure. One of my uncles raised his glass and said, "To Abby, the pride of this family," and everyone else echoed it. The cheer rose up and clattered in the air, and I let my eyes rest on my folded hands. There wasn't a single word directed at me in that moment. No acknowledgement that I existed beyond the space I took up. As the night went on, the more I watched, the more it felt like I was looking at them through glass. They didn't mean to be cruel. It was just that to them, I had already been measured and found wanting years ago. I was background noise, someone who had fallen out of orbit while Abigail had soared. Every smile, every laugh, every story only made it clearer. This was their world. I was just passing through it, unnoticed and unneeded. Somewhere between another toast and another round of questions about Abigail's plans for the future, I felt a faint vibration against my hip, a rhythm so subtle no one else could notice. It was the kind of signal that doesn't belong to a phone, the kind of alert that comes from a piece of equipment no one in that house would ever recognize. For a moment, I stayed still, listening to the hum of voices around me as if they belonged to a different world, and then I slipped my hand into the hidden pocket of my jacket. The screen was no larger than a deck of cards, matte black, no brand, no buttons. One line pulsed softly across it. Priority directive. Fort Huachuca. Immediate. The letters felt like a lifeline. It had been months since the last time I'd been called in on short notice, and for the first time that night, I felt the muscles in my face shift into something close to a real smile. I locked the device, slid it back into my coat, and glanced up to see if anyone had noticed. They hadn't. My parents were deep in another story about Abigail's promotion. My aunt was swirling the last inch of wine in her glass. My uncle was arguing about who made the better barbecue ribs, and Abigail herself was leaning forward to answer a cousin's question about her next training cycle. It was as if I wasn't even in the room, which suited me fine. My heart was no longer here. My thoughts were already stretching across the desert toward that base in Arizona, toward a place where my presence had meaning and my silence carried weight. While they laughed and clapped each other on the back, I sat still, my hand resting against the hidden device, feeling the hum of responsibility settle back into my chest like something I had been waiting for. When I finally exhaled, it was slow, steady, and different from any breath I had taken since I walked into that house. I realized how numb I had been all evening, how I had held myself so tightly in check that my face must have looked like a mask. Now, for the first time, I let a hint of life return. They might still see me as the failure they had already written out of the family story, but I knew where I was going when this night was over, and for once, that was enough. By the time the desert sun began to rise over the low hills of southern Arizona, I was already on the grounds of Fort Huachuca. The air was sharp and dry, full of the smell of dust and metal, the kind of morning that always felt like the start of something decisive. Across the training field, recruits were running drills, boots pounding in unison, rifles balanced on their shoulders with mechanical precision. Orders crack through the air like whips, and among the voices I recognized one I hadn't heard in years. Abigail's tone was clipped, sharp, perfectly measured, her posture rigid as she corrected a recruit's stance. From a distance, she looked every bit the ideal instructor. Calm authority wrapped in a clean uniform. I stayed back, low on the bleachers, blending in with a few civilian contractors and administrative staff, just another face among people who were only there to observe. I had no intention of being seen. That was the entire point. But the field had a way of noticing what it shouldn't. The senior drill sergeant, stocky, with a gravel voice that carried over the sound of boots, was moving down the line of recruits when his gaze swept casually toward the bleachers. His eyes slid past everyone else and stopped dead on me. Something in his posture shifted, a sudden stillness that made the air around him tighten. He stared for a beat longer, then without a word pivoted sharply and strode straight toward where I was sitting. Conversations around me faltered. The recruits froze mid-motion, unsure of what was happening. Even Abigail glanced up, frowning slightly, as the sergeant came to a full stop just a few feet from me. And then it happened. He snapped to attention with a speed that could cut glass, hand rising in a flawless salute. "General Morgan, ma'am," he said, his voice steady but just loud enough for every ear on that field to hear. The world seemed to drop into silence. I rose slowly, returning the salute with a quiet calm that only made the moment heavier. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Abigail's rifle slip from her hands and hit the ground with a hollow thud, her mouth parting in stunned disbelief. No one had told her. No one had told any of them. And now the secret I had guarded for years stood in front of them with a single word. General. By the time I stepped out of the bleachers and left the field, the damage was already done. Whispers moved faster than orders, slipping through the rows of recruits like wind through tall grass. I didn't have to look back to know that every eye on that range had locked onto me, that every unspoken question was already turning into stories that would spread to every mess hall and barracks before the day was done. No one had been told who I was. That was by design. And now, with a single salute, years of careful anonymity had cracked open. I kept walking, calm, steady, my hands loose at my sides, because the one thing you learn fast in my line of work is that you never let the room see you hurry. Behind me, the drills resumed, but the rhythm had changed. The cadence was softer, scattered. Abigail's voice wavered as she called out commands, and more than once she glanced in the direction I had gone, as if she was trying to fit the pieces of me into a shape she had never considered. She knew I had left. She knew I had failed out of college and disappeared, but she had never once asked where I went or why. Now, standing there in the middle of her recruits with her rifle at her feet, she realized for the first time just how little she had known about the person she'd been so sure was nothing. Shock settled over her like a shadow, and I could almost feel the weight of it pressing through the air as I reached the gate. The rest of the day, the bass hummed with a kind of tension I had felt before, but hadn't missed. Conversations stopped when I walked by. People who'd never seen me before whispered my name, testing the sound of it like a rumor they weren't sure they were supposed to believe. And Abigail, for all her perfect posture and calm command, couldn't escape it either. Every step she took, every question from the other instructors, reminded her that the person she thought she had left behind wasn't who she imagined. That night, long after the drills ended, I knew she sat on her bunk staring at the ceiling, wondering how many pieces of my life she had chosen not to see. That night, the quiet of Fort Huachuca didn't last. I was in the temporary quarters they'd assigned me, a plain room with blackout curtains and walls that smelled faintly of dry dust and bleach, when the encrypted tablet on the desk lit up in a stuttering pulse. Not the usual low-level notifications I'd grown used to over the years, but a full-spectrum alarm that meant something had gone very wrong. Red text bled across the screen. Unauthorized access detected. Secure network breach. For a second, I just stared at it, feeling that old, familiar cold settle into my chest. Then my hands moved fast, pulling up the trace logs, watching the path of the intrusion appear in fractured segments. This wasn't an external attack. It was coming from inside the base. I pulled the drive from the wall safe, decrypted the file, and stared at the profile tag that appeared at the end of the chain. The ID code was one I hadn't seen in years. An old retired clearance burned out of the system long ago. Mine. It made no sense at first. That clearance should have been untouchable, sealed off when I transitioned from field operations to deep strategy work. The only way it could have been activated was if someone had stumbled across an old device still tied to me, one the system thought belonged to the past. I dug deeper, opening layers of metadata, each one like peeling back paper on a time bomb. There it was. The access point wasn't a laptop or an external network key. It was a small field tablet, standard issue during training exercises, stripped of advanced protocols, but still capable of triggering a legacy shadow file. I remembered that tablet because I had given it away. A year ago. To Abigail. It had been stuffed in an old duffel, forgotten equipment that I hadn't thought twice about leaving with her when I stopped by on a rare visit. And now it had opened a door I had spent a decade keeping closed. The breach was contained before anything critical could be pulled, but the damage wasn't in the data. It was in what the system saw. The wrong people would think this was me. I closed the tablet slowly and leaned back in the chair, staring at the ceiling as the realization settled. Abigail had no idea what she had just stepped on. She had no idea what kind of shadow she had dragged into the light. I had her brought to one of the small briefing rooms on the second floor of the command building, a narrow space with plain walls and a single table between us. When she walked in, she looked more like a recruit than an instructor. Her posture rigid, her hands clasped too tightly behind her back, her eyes darting between me and the door like she was waiting for someone else to deliver the punishment she assumed was coming. I didn't make her wait. I told her to sit, and she did. Shoulders square, jaw tight, still trying to hold on to that composure she had always worn like armor. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. I could see the questions gathering behind her eyes, the pieces of the last 24 hours she hadn't been able to fit together. Then I slid a small encrypted tablet across the table and said quietly, "Do you know what this is?" She shook her head. "It's the device you triggered tonight. It opened a door no one was supposed to find." She blinked, clearly confused, and started to speak, but I stopped her with a raised hand. "I know you didn't mean to. I know you had no idea. But I need you to understand exactly what you stepped into. That tablet wasn't just old equipment. It was tied to a clearance that doesn't exist on paper anymore. When you accessed it, you woke up something buried years ago, and the system treated it like I was the one breaking in. If I hadn't been here, you'd be under formal investigation right now, and half the base would already be looking at you like a traitor. You don't realize how thin the ice is in this world until you hear it cracking under your own feet." I watched her face pale, the confusion turning slowly into fear as the weight of my words sank in. She opened her mouth again, but this time there was no defense, no anger, only a whisper. "I didn't know." I nodded once. "I believe you," I said, and I meant it. "That's why this ends here. I'm not going to report you. You're going to come with me instead. You'll see exactly how deep this goes, and you're going to help me fix it. And after that, you're going to decide what kind of soldier you really want to be. Because from now on, every step you take is going to matter." For the first time since I walked back into her life, she didn't argue. The next morning, before the desert heat could crawl over the base, I walked Abigail into the secure data wing where the walls hum with servers and the air feels colder than it should. Mark Brooks was already there waiting for us, leaning against a console like a man who had spent a lifetime in uniform and no longer needed to prove anything. I trusted him because he had no interest in politics, no patience for games. He listened when I explained what had happened and didn't waste time asking why. Instead, he keyed us into a side network and started pulling access logs with the calm efficiency of someone who has lived his whole career in quiet emergencies. Abigail stood just behind me, silent, watching the two of us work like she had stumbled into a world she didn't even know existed. The records came in one after another, long streams of timestamps and encrypted signatures, and as we traced them backward, the pattern started to form. This breach hadn't been sloppy. It had been built to look like chaos while every single step pointed straight back to my old credentials. Someone wanted it to look like I was the one opening those files. They wanted to use that old tablet like a doorway into my past, and Abigail had just been the perfect key to unlock it. By the time we hit the last layer of the trace, the shape of the plan was obvious. Whoever was behind it had been waiting for years, biding their time until the right opportunity came along to expose a ghost I had spent my career keeping buried. I glanced over my shoulder at Abigail and saw the dawning realization in her eyes. "So it was never about me," she said quietly. "It was about you." I nodded. "They wanted to drag me out," I told her. "And you were the easiest way to do it." Brooks leaned over the screen, arms folded, and added in his low, steady voice, "This was deliberate. Somebody out there wanted to paint you as the traitor, and they almost did." For the first time since this began, Abigail's expression shifted. Not defensive, not angry, just a new kind of understanding. She was starting to see the war I had been fighting all these years, the one no one at that family table had ever known about. Hours bled away in that cold room, the three of us bent over the console, peeling back the layers of the attack one by one. Each fragment of code carried a fingerprint, and as we followed the trail through hidden servers and forgotten archives, a name I hadn't spoken in years started to surface like something ugly rising out of deep water. The last relay wasn't random. It led to a cluster of old simulation files from a mission in Eastern Europe, the kind of low-level data no one should have been able to access anymore. And embedded in those logs, hidden so carefully it almost looked like an accident, was the signature of a man I knew far too well. Thomas Croft. It hit me like a fist to the chest. Abigail saw the way I froze, and for a long second I didn't say a word. When I finally spoke, my voice was steady but sharper than I meant it to be. "It's him. He's been sitting in the dark all these years, waiting for a chance." Abigail asked what had happened between us, why his name seemed to poison the air the moment I said it. I told her. About the mission 5 years ago, a remote village and a bad lead. Croft had been the officer in command then, and when intelligence suggested insurgent activity, he didn't hesitate. He ordered a purge, no waiting for confirmation, no regard for civilians. I refused. I went over his head, filed a full report, and by the time it was over, the only thing that saved that village from being wiped off the map was the fact that I stood in the way. It cost him his promotion, cost him his career, and he never forgave me for it. He disappeared after that, but I always knew a man like him wouldn't stay gone. He was the kind who turns revenge into a purpose. Brooks leaned over the console, his face hard. Looks like he planted something before he left. A worm buried in those old systems waiting for someone to stumble across it. And Abigail, pale and silent, whispered the truth neither of us wanted to say out loud. And I was the one who woke it up. I met her eyes and shook my head. No, this was Croft's move. You were just the spark he needed. Out in the desert beyond the glass, the sun was sinking, and I knew this wasn't over. He wanted me exposed. Now he had my attention. It started with a flicker on the screens, a small distortion that at first looked like a glitch, and then the code began to unravel in front of us like a thread pulled from the wrong seam. Lines of commands poured across the console faster than a human could type, jumping from archive to archive, pulling up old simulation data with my signature stamped on every page. Croft wasn't hiding anymore. He was using everything he had left to bury me in the kind of evidence that looks clean to anyone who doesn't know where to look. The alarms in the data wing switched from yellow to red, the sound sharp and insistent. Within minutes, a notice came through. My access was suspended, my name flagged as a primary internal threat. Around me, I could feel the walls of the base closing in. It was the perfect trap. He wanted me silenced, and this was how he would do it. The security team began to assemble, senior officers lining the hall outside, voices rising with words like tribunal and inquiry. They didn't see Croft's fingerprints. All they saw was my clearance, my history, my name attached to every stolen file. Brooke stood beside me, jaw tight, silent in that way that only someone who knows how dangerous the next words will be can stay silent. Before I could say a word, before I could even decide if I should try to talk them down, Abigail stepped forward. She moved out of the crowd, into the doorway, shoulders squared, and spoke with a clarity that cut through the chaos. "It was me," she said. "I used the device. I accessed those files. I didn't know what I was doing, but I triggered it." The room went still, the sound of the alarms fading into the background as every eye turned toward her. She didn't stop there. "If anyone is responsible for the breach, it's me," she said, louder now. "Not my sister. Not General Morgan. I opened the door without understanding what it was, and she has been trying to fix the damage I caused ever since. If you want someone to blame, blame me." For the first time since we were children, she stood between me and the rest of the world. I saw the surprise in their faces, and I felt something shift, something fragile and unspoken. Croft's plan had just run into something he hadn't accounted for. Abigail finally choosing to stand on my side. While the senior officers argued in the hall, I sat down at an unused terminal in the corner of the room and pulled a drive from inside my jacket. It was a slim piece of metal, scratched and unremarkable, but inside it held the last remnants of a backdoor network I had built years ago when Croft still thought he was untouchable. They had locked me out of the base systems, but they hadn't locked me out of my own ghost. I bypassed the mainframe completely, plugging straight into a subnet Croft wouldn't know still existed, a patch I had created for training simulations that had never been documented. My fingers moved across the keys on instinct, opening decoy channels and splitting the infected code into two paths. One real, one bait. Croft's virus latched onto the bait immediately, hungry for access. And I could feel his presence on the other end, confident he had me cornered. I didn't give him time to realize his mistake. Using the decoy as a mirror, I traced his commands back, one hop at a time, through rented servers, through a civilian uplink, through a mess of camouflage he had built around himself. Every step peeled away another layer of his arrogance. Behind me, Brooks had pulled Abigail aside, shielding her from the shouting officers who hadn't yet understood what was happening. My focus narrowed until the rest of the room blurred into nothing but code and pulse, until I saw the final signal bounce back from a housing block, just outside the wire. A rented apartment hidden in plain sight. "Got you," I whispered, and sent the coordinates straight to base security with a single keystroke. Within minutes, the building was surrounded. They dragged him out without a fight. No guards, no escape plan. Just him sitting in front of a bank of stolen equipment with that same cold smile on his face. Even cuffed, he turned toward me when I walked in, and for a moment, I saw the same man I'd stood against years ago in a frozen village halfway across the world. "You think this ends here?" he asked. But his voice was thin, no weight behind it now. I stopped in front of him, close enough that only he could hear me. "It ends exactly here," I said, and for the first time his smile faltered. The officers hauled him away, and the room seemed to breathe again. Croft's shadow had finally been pulled into the light. The tribunal was held in one of the older halls at the western sector of the base, a long room lined with polished wood that made every word echo as if it carried more weight than it should. Senior officers filled the benches, their faces carved into masks of formality, and at the center table I sat with my hands folded, watching Croft being led in wearing civilian clothes but still carrying himself like a man who believed he could talk his way out of anything. The panel opened with his testimony. A smooth stream of accusations about my record, my supposed recklessness, and the data he claimed proved I had compromised operations for years. He spread out his forged logs like a magician laying out cards, confident that no one in that room could see where the tricks began. When they finally turned to me and asked for a response, I didn't argue. I simply asked permission to show them something. One by one, I laid out the evidence we had recovered. The trace logs that led straight to his hidden workstation, the timestamps showing his access under false credentials, the embedded worm he planted 5 years ago and left buried for someone else to trip over. Brooks stood behind me like a silent wall, passing forward the encrypted drives while Abigail handed over the tablet she had triggered and explained how she had stumbled into the trap. Then I brought out the final piece. A signed directive from years ago, Croft's own order authorizing an unconfirmed purge of civilians during the mission that had ended his career. Along with it, an audio file recovered from the same mission, my voice calling for a hold fire, telling the unit to wait until recon confirmed the targets. For a moment, the room was so quiet you could hear the old clock on the far wall ticking between seconds. The colonel in charge of the panel leaned forward, his gaze fixed on Croft. The smooth certainty was gone from Croft's face, replaced by the slow tightening of a man watching his lies collapse. "Why didn't you bring any of this forward before?" the colonel asked me. I answered without looking away. "Because doing the right thing isn't about being seen, but if you come for me, you better come with the truth." The decision came quickly. The charges against me were dismissed, my clearance restored, and Croft was ordered into custody to face a formal court-martial. For the first time in years, I let myself exhale. The Pentagon auditorium was silent when I walked on stage, the kind of silence that holds steady under the weight of expectation. Rows of uniforms and dark suits filled the seats. Analysts and officers and reporters all waiting to hear a story they thought they already knew. The screen behind me was blank except for one simple line: "Courage in the shadows." I stood at the podium in my dress blues with no medals pinned to my chest, only the plain insignia that had always been enough for me. I didn't clear my throat, didn't smile for the cameras. Instead, I told them the truth. I told them that there is a kind of strength that doesn't come with applause, that there are people who choose to stand in the dark so others can stand in the light, and that the cost of that choice isn't measured in rank or recognition, but in the weight of what you carry when no one else is watching. I spoke of mistakes, of silence, of how easy it is for the world to celebrate those who are visible, and forget the ones who hold the line unseen. I told them about Croft without naming him, about the danger of power left unchecked, and the temptation to erase what is inconvenient. I told them that the hardest part of service isn't the battles fought in daylight. It's the ones no one ever hears about. And then I paused, letting the quiet stretch long enough for every face in that hall to feel the difference between the stories they tell and the ones they never ask for. My eyes found her in the front row. Abigail sat there in her uniform, hands clasped around a binder full of notes, her back straight, but her face softer than I had ever seen it. So I told them about her. I told them how someone I love made a mistake that almost cost everything, and how, instead of running from it, she stood up and admitted the truth when no one else would. I told them that courage isn't a rank, that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is stand next to someone when the whole world expects you to walk away. I stepped back from the microphone and asked Abigail to stand. She did, and the room rose with her, not for me, but for us. For the first time seeing that we had both learned what it means to carry weight in silence. The airport was quiet in the early morning, the kind of quiet that comes just before the day remembers how busy it's supposed to be. Out on the tarmac, a military transport plane stood waiting, engines low and steady, the faint smell of fuel drifting on the wind. I walked across the concrete with my duffel over my shoulder, my orders sealed in the pocket of my jacket. Another mission waiting in a place no one in my family would ever see. Near the gate, leaning against the railing as if she had been there all night, stood Abigail. She wasn't wearing her dress uniform this time, just a simple service jacket, hair pulled back, face bare of makeup. When she saw me, she straightened and reached into her pocket without saying a word. She pulled out a small box wrapped in the corner of an old uniform shirt. Inside, nestled against the worn fabric, was the insignia I had thought I'd lost years ago. The metal had been polished until it gleamed, the surface smooth again where scratches used to run deep. She held it out to me like it was something fragile, like she understood for the first time what it meant to carry it. I took it from her and closed my fingers around it, feeling the weight of everything it stood for. There were no speeches, no apology, no explanation. She just looked at me with a quiet, steady expression that said all the things we had never managed to say in a lifetime of talking past each other. I pinned the insignia inside my jacket, close to my heart, and for a long moment we simply stood there, two sisters on opposite sides of the same life, finally finding the same ground. When the call came to board, I set the duffel down for just a second and stepped forward. She did the same. We met in a silent embrace, strong and sure, holding on without needing words. The wind coming off the runway tugged at our jackets, but neither of us moved until the last possible moment. Then I picked up my bag and walked toward the plane. I didn't look back, but I could feel her watching as I climbed the ramp. The engines rose to a roar, the ground falling away beneath me, and as the sky opened ahead, I touched the insignia again. It was time to disappear into the work once more, but this time, I didn't feel quite so alone.